What's up, class? Professor Calderon here. um, yeah, here we are, class, during COVID. So I'm going to be posting a series of videos instead of lectures, lecture videos, and then you guys can come in and ask me questions about them. And I'm doing it this way so that there's no appointment conflicts with anyone, so that you guys can have access to the lecture even if you have like some sort of conflict with timing or anything. So it'll be on YouTube waiting for you. Okay. This is the book, World Cinema. It's a pretty big book. Make sure you buy the older edition so you're not paying. They do have a newer edition, which is about $120, I think. Don't buy that one. Buy the older edition. Okay. So, I'm going to try and do this as conversational as possible, even though it's kind of weird because I'm just sitting here talking into my cell phone. I'm used to having a class full of filmmakers, you know, but this will do. Okay, so I'm going to pass the general introduction. I'm looking directly out the book now. And I'm going to jump straight to page 6, the early years. Let me just read this quote. Okay, this is from the book, The Early Years. The history of cinema did not begin with a big bang, no single event, whether Edison's patented invention of the kinetoscope in 1891 or the Lumiere brothers' first projection of films to paying audiences in 1895 can be held to separate, nebulous pre-cinema and cinema proper. Rather, there is a continuum which begins with early experiments and devices aimed at representing images in sequence. So there was no drive, per se, to make a cinematic experience. They were experimenting with viewing images in sequence and playing with that to represent or recreate natural movement. Okay? The magic lantern, film, and television do not constitute three separate universes. The magic lantern was like, in the book you read, it's like the early version of like one of the film devices. But they are together as a part of a single process of evolution. It is nonetheless possible to distinguish them not only technologically and in terms of the way they were diffused, but also chronologically. The magic lantern show gradually gives way to the film show at the beginning of the 20th century, while television emerges fully in the second half of the century. So there's not like this, boom, we're going to develop film. Boom, we're going to develop TV. Boom. No, there was a continuum of it. Then they kind of flowed together. And that's what they're saying here. It was a single process of evolution. And yeah, they kind of flowed together in succession. So, on page 6, the basic apparatus. You should know how films recreate their illusion. And it's a continuous movement by passing a series of discrete images in a quick succession in front of a light source, enabling the images to be projected on the screen. To lead to the number of experiments in the 1880s and 1890s, they are aimed at reproducing the so-called persistent vision effect with sequential photographs. So they were concerned about this effect of recreating the illusion of movement with using a series of images that are flashed on a screen, projected on a screen. The norm was around 16 frames per second back then. And it stayed that common. Sorry, I do that a lot. I get choked up on my words. Blah, blah. Okay, the average was 16 frames per second. That means in 1 second, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 images would show 16 individual images would show. And that 16 frames per second, they found out, was the minimum required to recreate that smooth illusion of motion in an object on the screen. And that 16 frames per second remained common until the 1920s. Nowadays, it's different. Everything is digital. You don't have to know this. This is just because it's part of current history. Everything is digital now. And we don't have frames per second per se. It's more of flipping individual pixels to individual colors, which gives us that high density, that HD picture. Okay? But this is all pre-HD. This is all film. Okay, so on page 7, the moving image as a form of collective entertainment, what we call cinema, developed and spread in the form of photographic images printed on a flexible and semi-transparent celluloid base. Then they cut this base into 35 millimeter strips wide. And this material, they called film, was developed by Henry M. Rickenbacken for George Eastman in 1889 on the basis of inventions variously attributed to the brothers. Okay, so Edison is developing what's called the film stock, and the stock is just a transparent celluloid that the image gets sort of burned onto, like a negative. Back in the day, that stuff was highly flammable, very flammable. A lot of them would catch fire. The base of the great majority of 35 millimeter films produced from February 1951 consists of cellulose nitrates, which is highly flammable. And from that date onwards, the nitrates base has been replaced by one of the cellulose acetate. You don't have to know this, but it's good history. So the early film stock was very flammable. And then in 1951, they replaced it with cellulose acetate, which is less flammable. So the first known examples of these procedures date back to 1905. Safety film was the norm for non-professionals' use after the First World War. Okay, on the page, turning to page 8, down in the middle. I'm talking about formats, film formats now. The 35 millimeter wide for cellulose was first adopted in 1892 by Thomas Edison for his kinetoscope. This is important. This is going to be on the quiz and on the final. The kinetoscope is a viewing device which enables one spectator at a time to watch brief segments of film. It was such a success that they adopted it for the 35 millimeter format. And basically, a kinetoscope is this machine. It's like about the size of an ATM, maybe a little bit bigger, and it has a viewing. It had a viewing thing on there. You look into. You drop your nickel in, and you look into this little viewfinder, and you would see a movie. A movie, not so much what you would think today with a storyline and a narrative and a lead actor and all that. It was more of a scene. Okay? The kinetoscope was a commercial success. The subsequent machines for reproducing images in the movement adopted 35 millimeter was the standard format. So Eastman Kodak the standard format was 35 millimeter. But Eastman Kodak was producing a 70 millimeter film. Now you cut that film in half and you get 35 millimeter. That's what they were doing with these kinetoscopes. They were cutting them in half. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about how they became the standards. For a while, that 70 millimeter and 35 millimeter film dominated the market. That's all we watched up to a while, up until digital came out. Okay, at 35 millimeter, 70 millimeter frame. So these technologies in film held up for for quite some time. Okay, but there were still ongoing attempts to expand the image and make it better. They weren't really settled on that. So that's the main thing to pick up: the 35 millimeter, the 70 millimeter from Eastman Kodak. Cut that 70 millimeter in half, you get 35. Okay, color. Sorry. As early as 1896, copies of films which had been hand colored frame by frame with very delicate brushes were available. The results achieved by this technique were often spectacular, as in the case of George Méliès' Le Roman de Fuse. I'm probably saying this all wrong. I don't speak French. Whose images have the glow of medieval miniatures. It is very difficult, however, to ensure that colors occupy the precise area of the frame. To achieve this, Path, in 1906, patented a mechanical method for coloring the base called path color. This method, also known as aperture in French and stencil in English, and it allowed for the application of half a dozen different tonalities. So here we have in 1896 the sort of emergence of hand painting film, which, if you can imagine, takes a long time, very painstaking. You have 14 frames per second. You know, you got 14 minutes, like say a film. So you can imagine how many frames you have to hand paint just to make that look color, that film look in color. So yeah, so they started playing with these processes of colored film in 1896. Okay, let's talk a little bit about sound on page 10. Almost all silent films had some sort of sound accompaniment. Early film shows had lecturers who gave a commentary on the single image going past on the screen, explaining their content and meaning to the audience. In a number of non-Western countries, this practice continued long beyond the early period. So this is how an early film would have went. An image would come up, and you would have a narrator telling you the importance of that image. Okay, that was the early advent of film sound, that narrator's voice. Music sometimes accompanied by noise effect. They were usually obtained by performers equipped with a wide array of objects reproducing natural and artificial sounds. Okay. From the beginning, however, the pioneers of the moving image had more grandiose ambitions. As early as 1895, Edison put forward a system for synchronizing his twin inventions, the phonograph and the kinetoscope. Path also seems to have attempted the synchronization of film disc around 1896. So you have two different polygenesis of film sound going on. You have Edison with the phonograph and the kinetoscope, and he's trying to sync the sound to that picture. And then you have Path in France doing the same thing. It was only after the First World War that the decisive steps were taken towards the achievement of synchronized sound film, and it came from Germany. In 1926, Hollywood studio Warner Brothers presented Don Juan using the Vitaphone system of sound synchronization. This was a sound-on-disc system linking the projector to two large discs. So you had two discs that would play, and they were synced to the film. Okay? I'm going to skip aspect ratio and jump to page 13, early cinema. Okay, the earliest films were little more than moving snapshots, barely 1 minute in length, and often consisting of just a single shot. So the early films weren't like the films that we see today, obviously. They were just a little more than a moving snapshot, like one moving single image. That's it. and they played 5 to 10 minutes long and employed changes of scenery and camera position to tell or illustrate a story or a theme. Then in the early 1910s, with the arrival of the first feature-length film, there gradually emerged a new set of conventions for handling complex narratives. Okay, so this complex narrative hasn't emerged yet. It's slowly coming, and this is in 1905. What they were just an image you would see of an interesting place or an interesting event. Like I think it was Lumière's, he recorded a train pulling up into a station. That was kind of famous. So we didn't really have this drive yet to tell a story. That came later. So by 1905, they had these 5 to 10 minute long scenes. By the 1910s, there was the first feature-length film. So, with this first feature-length film, no longer was the film show a curiosity sandwiched in between a variety of other spectacles. Instead, specialist venues had been created. So now they're creating special venues to view this new phenomenon, film. They're creating these venues for exhibitions and films supplied by a large number of production and distribution companies based in major cities. Now, these movies that were being made were being exhibited, they were being sold to exhibitors all around the world, not rented. Today we rent them, movie rentals. Okay, the cinema of this period from the 1980s to the 1980s, the cinema from the mid-1890s to the mid-1910s is sometimes referred to as pre-Hollywood cinema, all right? Attesting to the growing hegemony of the California-based American industry after the First World War, it was described as pre-classical in recognition of the role of the consolidated set of classical narrative conventions was to play in the world cinema from 1920s onward. So there was this classical set of narrative conventions of telling a story. That was that one wide shot that just stood there, and you would see it. And you wouldn't really cut away. You wouldn't really cut to anything else. You would just get that one wide shot. And that was the classical way of telling a movie. And then later on, they slowly started bringing in narrative, which was borrowed from theater. Okay. Precisely dating the first exhibition of moving pictures depends upon whether exhibition means private or publicly for a paying audience. Seen in the kinetoscope, or this is the problem. This is the, I wouldn't say a problem, but one of the truths about the origin of film, is that no one can sort of lay claims to being first. Okay, so back to this. Precisely dating the first exhibition of moving pictures depends upon whether exhibition means in private, publicly, or for a paying audience, seen in a kinetoscope or projected on a screen. One could date the first show of motion pictures from 1893, when Edison first perfected the kinetoscope, to December of 1895 and the Lumière's demonstration at the Grand Cafe. Lumière's may not have been the first to project moving images on a screen to a paying audience. This honor belongs to the German Max van Skandaldowski, who had done the same in Berlin 2 months before Cinematog's famed public exhibition. So it's kind of difficult to put a finger on, or you can't put a finger on who was first, unless you sort of redefine your parameters of your definition of exhibition. The Lumière's cinematography showed, that was a different machine developed by Lumière's, showed primarily documentary material established by French primacy. But their compatriot, Georges Méliès, became the world's leading producer of fiction films during this early cinema period. Okay, so Méliès was doing fantasy. and fiction. He was like making up stories, things that couldn't be possibly be real. Well, that laid in the mind and the realm of fantasy. Whereas Lumiere's was handling truth and reality, like this documentary style recording. Mm-hmm. Eventually, okay, the Star Films Company began in the 80s. Malay's Star Film Company began production in 1896, and by the spring of 97, he had his own studio outside of Paris, producing hundreds of films between 1896 and 1912, and establishing distribution offices in London, Barcelona, Berlin, 1902, and in New York, 1903. So, so Malay was finding a lot of success with these fantasy movies, and he almost drove the Lumieres out of business. So that's one thing to remember about those two. They were two different schools of thought, and even today, they say that all filmmakers come from one of these two schools of thought: the Lumieres, which would be the documentary style, neo-realism, or Malay, which is this fantasy, or this fantasy style dealing with the fantastic. Okay, so mind you, as all this is going on, there's still technological developments that are coming to the forefront. For example, where are we? Edison's moving picture machine were actually produced by a team of technicians working in his laboratory in West Orange, New Jersey, supervised by English William Kennedy, Laurie Dixon. Dixon and his associates began working on moving pictures in 1889, and by 1893 had built a kinetograph, a workable but bulky camera, and the kinetoscope, a peep show-like viewing machine in which a continuous strip of film between 40 and 50 feet ran between an electric lamp and a shutter. They also developed the first motion picture studio, developed by the kinetograph's size, weight, and relative immobility. Okay. As with Lumiere's, Edison, this is Thomas Edison now, his key position in film history stems from marketing skills rather than technical ingenuity. This is from page 15. His company was the first to market a commercially viable moving picture, albeit one designed for individual viewers rather than mass audiences. So he was the first to design one for a moving picture for a viewing audience, although it was for one person, not a whole audience full. As with Lumiere's, Edison immediately embarked upon plans for commercial exploitation, entering into business agreements that led to establishments of kinetoscope parlors around the country. The first kinetoscope parlor was a rented storefront with rooms for 10 of the viewing machines, each of them showing a different view, opened in New York City around April. So these kinetoscopes started popping up all everywhere. Edison's kinetoscope, and they were very, very popular, very entertaining. Until the spring of 1896, the Edison Company devoted itself to shooting films for the kinetoscope. But as the novelty of the kinetoscope parlors wore off and the machines fell off, Edison began to rethink his commitment to individually oriented exposition. So the kinetoscope is everywhere, but the popularity of them is starting to wane. And so Edison starts to rethink about this idea of showing films to one person, and as opposed to showing one film to like hundreds of people in an exhibition hall. So up until that time of spring, in the spring of 1896, he was fully dedicated to that idea. The sheer novelty of moving pictures. Okay, people were tripping off that a picture is actually moving. Okay, rather than the content or the story. They weren't tripping off the story. They were just tripping off the fact that, wow, we have moving images, moving pictures. And it was the attraction. But within a year, there were several hundred vitascopes giving shows in various locations throughout the United States. At the turn of the century, Britain was the third most important film-producing country. The Edison kinetoscope was first seen there in October 1894, But because Edison's uncharacteristic failure, he didn't patent it. He took his machine, his uh, his 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 kinetoscope, to Britain, failed to patent it, which left him vulnerable. So what's this guy's name? This guy comes in, Earl. An Englishman named, okay, so here we go. The Englishman R.W. Paul legally copied the non-protected viewing machine and installed 15 kinetoscopes at the exhibition hall at Earl's Court in London. When Edison belatedly sought to protect his interests by cutting off the supply of films, Paul responded by going into production for himself in 1899 in conjunction with Burt Akers, who supplied the necessary technical expertise. Paul opened the first British film studio in North London. Okay, so because Edison, he failed, he failed to copyright, to patent his invention. Someone in Great Britain stole it, copied it, and started a business around it, and opened up the first studio in London. Okay, so that's a great one thing to note about Edison. During this time, production and distribution and exhibition was much different. Today we have what's called specializations. You got to go to one person for production, one team for exhibition, another team for distribution. It's very specialized. But back then, it was just one-stop shop that does all. So around this time, at the turn of the century, this different practice of specializations started emerging, where the division of labor within the film industry started, they started dividing things up. Okay, like you got to go to one team for production, one team for exhibition and distribution. So it was all different then from what it was now behind the scenes. Here's an example. I'm reading from page 16 at the bottom. Initially, production, distribution, and exhibition all remained the exclusive province of the film manufacturer. The Lumiere traveling cameraman used the adaptable cinematography to shoot, develop, and project films. So the cameraman was shooting, developing, and projecting the film. While American studios such as Edison and Biograph usually supplied a projector, film, and even a projectionist to do the vaudeville houses that constituted the primary exhibition sites. Even with the rapid emergence of independent traveling showmen in the United States, Britain, and Germany, film distribution remained non-existent. Producers rather sold than rented their films, a practice which forestalled the development of permanent exhibition sites until the second decade of cinema's history. Okay. So next, I want to talk about style of the day. The style of filmmaking during this era was very distinct. Generally speaking, I'm reading from the book. Until 1907, filmmakers concerned themselves with the individual shot. They preserved the spatial aspect of the pro-filmic event. They did not create temporal relations or story causality by using cinematic interventions. Cinematic interventions would be like a cross cut or a splice, where the film goes from one scene to the next. They weren't doing that. They weren't like taking a shot and show the wide and then go in and show you a close-up. They weren't doing that. They were not looking at the temporal relationships between one scene and the next, meaning how our mind connects those two things and creates a story out of it. They weren't looking at that. That hadn't emerged yet. Uh, they set the camera far enough from the action to show the entire length of the human body, as well as the spaces above the head and below the feet. The camera was kept stationary, particularly in exterior shots. So you have one camera stationary, locked off, doing nothing. And that was it. I mean, compared to what we have nowadays, I was doing live events with 4 cameras shooting simultaneously, and I'm switching live, going between 4 cameras. You know, one camera's got the wide shot, the master, and then another camera can zoom in. You know, um, and you use those various shots to cross cut, and what happens is the human mind, draws causal relationships between the images, between the scenes. Okay? So back then, they weren't really concerned with that. Okay, look, right here on page 17. Concerning themselves primarily with the individual shot, early filmmakers tended not to be overly interested in connections between shots, that is, editing. So they weren't concerned with the editing. They did not elaborate conventions for linking one shot to the next, for constructing a continuous linear narrative, for the viewer to keep orientation in time and space. However, there are some multi-shot films produced during this period, although rare in 1902. In fact, one can break the pre-1907 years into 2 subsidiary periods, when the majority of films consisted of one-shots, and when there would be call for documentaries, known back then, that used multi-shots. Okay, so the multi-shot film was just starting to emerge, just starting. We weren't that savvy on building narratives, stories. It was just one scene. Okay. On page 17 at the top, 1894 to 1902, the work of the most important French producers of this period, the Lumière and Millet, provides an example of the textual conventions of the one shot. Perhaps the most famous film that the Lumière showed in December 1895 is The Train Arriving at a Station, which runs for about 50 seconds. A stationary camera shows a train pulling into the station and the passengers disembark. The film's continuing until almost all of them have exited the shot. That was it. That was a famous movie that they made back in the day. Contemporary accounts indicate that these other Lumière films fascinate their audiences not by depicting riveting events, but through incidental details that a modern viewer may find almost unnoticeable. The gentle movement of leaves in the background as a baby eats breakfast, the play of light on water as boat leaves the harbor. The first film audiences did not demand to be told stories, but found infinite fascination in the mere recording and reproduction of the movement of inanimate and animate objects. Okay? This is the period of 1894 to 1902 we're talking about. Okay. On page 18, this is important. Midway down, we have a paragraph. Unlike Lumière's, George Millet always shot in his studio. Okay? Lumière's was more of like a documentarian, shooting real life, whereas Millet was experimenting in his studio, recreating staging action for the camera. He was showing fantastical events that could not happen in real life. And you'll see one with Trip to the Moon. Although Millet's films conform to the standard period tableau style, they are also replete with magical appearances and disappearances, achieved through what cinematographers call stop action. So Millet was really playing around with special effects early on in the game to achieve storytelling, narrative-telling capabilities. He manipulated images through superimposition of one shot over another, so that many of the films of the films represent space in a manner more reminiscent of photographic devices developed during the 19th century than for theater. So Mallet was really experimenting with special effects, trying to layer film on top of film, and just to produce a different type of image. Okay. So from 1902 to 1907, the multi-shot film, I'm skipping forward on page 19, the multi-shot film emerged as the norm rather than the exception, with films no longer treated like individual shots as a self-contained unit of meaning, but linking one shot to another. Filmmakers may have been using a succession of shots to capture and emphasize the high points of the action rather than construct either a linear narrative, causality, or clearly established temporal relationship. As befits the cinema of attractions, the editing was intended to enhance the visual pleasure rather than refine the narrative developments. So we got these cross shots, but they're still looking at bolstering the event and not the narrative. If that makes sense. The narrative being a story. Okay? Around this time was around this time, a film was released called Trip to the Moon. And this one exemplifies the technological advances in film, that storytelling of the time. Okay? Trip to the Moon. I lost my page. Okay. I'm going to skip up a little bit. We talked about style. Transitional cinema, page 23. Between 1907 and 1913, the organization of the film industry in the United States and Europe began to emulate contemporary industrial capitalistic enterprises. Specializations increased as production, distribution, and exhibition became separate and distinct areas. So as production and distribution and exhibition started branching off, there was a greater demand for films that infused this new style of way of storytelling. They were looking for new product instead of the standard film practices. So what started to emerge was a division of labor that, how I say it, the specialized. The cameraman does only the camera. There's a grip department, and all they do is electric. There's the gaffer's department, all they deal with is lighting, and so on and so on and so on. Okay? So as things become more specialized, the demand starts going up. The films of this period are often referred to as the cinema of narrative integration. So this no longer was a reliance upon viewers' extra-textual knowledge of the film, but rather employed cinematic conventions to create internally coherent narratives. The average film reached a standard length of a 1,000-foot reel and ran for about 15 minutes now, although the so-called feature film was running for an hour or more, and it also made its first appearance during these years. Okay, so there's a different demand for a different type of film now that goes just beyond the exhibition of interesting locations and events. You know, people are starting to demand stories. They want their films to tell a story. Okay? Before the First World War, European film, I'm on page 23, the bottom, transitional cinema. Before the First World War, European film industries dominated the international market with France, Italy, and Denmark. And France, Italy, and Denmark are the strongest exporters. From 60 to 70% of the world's imported film into the United States and Europe were French. Think about that. 60 to 70% of the films in the US were French. from the path. U.S. producers face strong competition from European producers within their own country. So, the earlier move to rationalize film distribution in the earlier years resulted in the maximization of profits. And as a result, the U.S. manufacturers initially concentrated on the domestic market. However, during these years, they began a campaign of international expansion that resulted in their being well placed to step into the #1 position in 1914, when European film industries were reeling from the effects of the outbreak of World War. So as World War was breaking out, the European film industries were sort of reeling from this. But U.S. film manufacturers, they started to increasingly send out their films during this expansion period. So while the European film market was reeling from World War, the early American market was expanding. During this period, American film production took place mainly on the East Coast, with an outpost or two in Chicago. Some companies making occasional forays to the West Coast and even to foreign locations. New York City was the headquarters to 3 major studios during this time. Okay. So around 1903, there was a rise of what's called the film exchange. And it led to a crucial change in the I'm at page 25. This led to a crucial change in distribution practices, which in turn created a radical change in modes of exhibition. The rise of permanent venues, Nickelodeons that began to appear in numbers in the 1906 made the film industry a much more profitable business, encouraging others to join Edison. Vitagraph, and other producers. Until this time, companies had sold rather than rented their production exhibitors. While this worked well for the traveling showmen who changed their audiences from show to show, it actually worked against the establishment of permanent exhibition sites. So these Nickelodeons were the producers would sell their film to the Nickelodeons. And then as the Nickelodeons' popularity started decreasing, filmmakers switched to a different format of exhibition, where is the projection. And they started renting these films, not selling them, which led way to more profits and a more robust industry. Here's an important note. Okay. In late 1908, led by Edison and Biograph companies, the producers attempted to stabilize the industry and protect their own interests by forming the Motion Pictures Patent Company, or as it was properly known, the Trust. The Trust incorporated the important American producers and foreign film distributions in the United States and was intended to exert oligopolistic control over the industry. The members of the MPCC agreed to a standard price per foot for their film and to regulate the release of new films, each studio issuing from 1 to 3 reels a week on a pre-established schedule. In 1910, the MPPC, the Trust, began business practices that presaged those of the Hollywood studios, establishing a separate distribution arm, the General Film Company. This instituted standardizing orders and zoning requirements that prevented unnecessary competition by prescribing which exhibitors within a certain geographical area would show a film. Okay, so basically the MPCC came in. These guys, the Trust, came in, and they were like, all these producers, they got together and said, look, this is bananas. We need to regulate this. We need to come together and agree on certain prices of things so that we can bring some order to this market, to this film market. Okay? But the Motion Pictures Patent Company survived as a legal entity until 1915, when it was declared illegal under the provisions of the Sherman Antitrust Act. The Sherman Antitrust Act. So it was declared illegal. That's one of the questions on the quiz and the final. The illegality of the MPPC. Okay, so I'm skipping along. I'm going down to page 29. There's the beginning of narrative. There was a crisis in transitional cinema around 1907, signaled by the complaints in the trade press about lack of narrative clarity, as well as by exhibitors' increased use of lectures in any attempt to make films understandable to film. So they were using lectures during film to sort of make these films more understandable. But there was the cinema of attractions, right, and storytelling. In the transitional years between 1907 and 1917, the formal elements of filmmaking all became subsidiary to narrative, as lighting, composition, editing all increasingly designed to help audience follow the story. So around 1907 and 1917, we have this shift that solidifies the place of narrative in film. Okay? The editing, the lighting, the composition, everything sort of flows around the idea of the narrative. Okay? The increasing use of editing and the decreasing distance between camera and actors most obviously distinguish the films from the transitional period from their predecessors. The tableau, or the proscenium art shoot showing the actors' entire bodies as well as space above and below them, characterized the early cinema. However, towards the beginning of the transitional period, the Vitagraph company began using the so-called 9-foot line, staging action about 9 feet from the camera, a scale that showed the actors from the ankle up. At around the same time, in France, Path and other companies under its influence, Film d'Art, also adopted the 9-foot line. By 1911, the camera had moved yet closer, producing the 3/4 shot that became predominant scale of the transitional cinema. So now they're exploring with that space between the camera and the actor and how that affects the narrative. Okay, not the viewing pleasure, not the novelty of watching this. That how does this affect the telling of the story? Okay, just by distances between the camera. The transitional period also saw the emergence of editing patterns that was most closely associated with character subjectivity, the point of view shot, in which the film cuts from the character to what the character sees and then back to the character. Okay, so we have the character, then we cut to what the character sees, and then we cut back to the character to get his reaction to what he sees. This is the first time this is starting to emerge in the transition period. This practice is very common now. It's like it happens all the time. You don't even notice it. The last kind of editing not only externalize characters' thoughts, but help establish the spatial and temporal relationships crucial to narrative coherence, both in the same scene and between scenes taking place at the same time in different locations. So now they're playing with temporal and spatial relationships between scenes. For example, we can have a scene happen. This is off the top of my head. We have one scene where a car chase takes place, and then we cut to another scene where we can edit it in a certain way where the audience thinks that these two events are playing simultaneously. a baby being born. So we can cut between two scenes now in the editing, and it conveys this message to the audience that these two scenes are related through time and space. Okay, I'm gonna end this one right there. You guys put your questions in the discussion board, and I'll see you on the next one.